Hello, and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. It's been about a week since that infamous presidential debate, and I'm still a little worked up about not only how little the wars in Ukraine and Gaza played in the discussion, but the generally incoherent nature of the total 11 minutes devoted to them. I'm of the mind that if we are going to spend tens of billions of dollars on these wars, which we have already, 65 billion in the last 8 months to Israel, 175 billion in the last 2.5 years to Ukraine, then we should be giving it more than a passing glance in the presidential race. But alas, no one is really desirous of talking about this in any meaningful way because it would mean addressing the massive failures happening in both conflicts. So, here to join me today to actually give these issues substance is my friend, retired Colonel Doug Macgregor, who is the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. He is a decorated combat veteran, an author of 5 books, a PhD, and a defense and foreign policy consultant. He has been providing straightforward, common sense, and much needed criticism of the military and U.S. war policies since I met him in the early days of the Iraq War. And to my knowledge, he has never been wrong. So thank you for joining me today on Trip the Beltway Fantastic, Doug.
Well, there's not much fantastic about the Beltway these days, except people's ability to lie prolifically.
Absolutely. It is what they call it, the swamp, the Borg, the blob, what have you. But you are absolutely right about that. Well, first, I'd like to ask you about Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had renewed his ongoing calls for more long-range missiles, air defenses, after a weekend missile attack that killed 7 people in a small town near the southeastern city of Zaporizhia. There is a lot of pressure to supply these weapons to hit targets inside Russia, and the U.S. has already crossed several lines, many lines, by allowing some weapons to do so, but they're holding out. Could crossing this new line actually help Russia, like some of the commentary in Washington like to say?
You know, it's hard to understand how people interpret these things inside the Beltway. I think we need to keep in mind that on average right now, somewhere's between 10 and 15,000 Ukrainians are being killed each week. These are soldiers, overwhelmingly. Most of them are forced into uniform, dragged out of their houses, or picked up on the streets. A lot of them are increasingly boys, and many of them are old men that have no business being there. There are no quote-unquote counterattacks in reality because Ukrainians have next to no artillery ammunition to speak of. They tend to be people that are shoved into trenches in small numbers. They don't replace whole squads, platoons, or companies. They send in a group of 5 or 6 because if they send too many at once, there's a danger of rebellion, that these people will simply start fighting their way out of it, or they'll volunteer to surrender, or they'll refuse to obey orders because these people have little to no training. So the war is won by the Russians. The question is, for the Russians, how do you consolidate and secure victory, if you will? Because no one in the West at this point is willing to talk to them.
So Zelensky, I think it was on Friday. I know, this podcast will be published in several days, but he had made a statement to the press. I think it was a press conference. I can't remember where he said it. But he's already talking about a second global peace summit. We had the first one was in Switzerland earlier in June. Obviously, he wants to develop a peace plan based on his 10-point peace proposal, though he says now that he's open to opinions from other countries. He says, quote, "We don't have much time. We have a lot of injured, killed, both military and civilians, so we do not want this war to last for years. Therefore, we have to prepare this plan and put it on the table for a second peace summit." Are we hearing a shift from Zelensky here in terms of like how he is perceiving the trajectory of this war and how quickly or that the country needs to start moving towards some sort of diplomatic off-ramp, or am I reading too much into that?
I think privately those discussions have been underway for some time. But publicly, he is continuing to engage in the charade. The event in Switzerland was categorically absurd. How can you have any sort of discussion without the presence of the Russians? So is there for Western consumption. It's this hubris, arrogance, whatever you want to call it in the West, among the so-called globalist elite that refuses to deal with reality. I mean, I really think that many of them are so busy drinking their own Kool-Aid, they have no idea what is real and what isn't. So all sorts of terrible things are now possible. And I think behind the scenes, there are groups of people in Ukraine who are working towards a solution, but there are large numbers of groups who are trying to figure out how much damage they can inflict on the way out. Now, Zelensky is no longer the legitimately elected leader of the country. As you know, he suspended elections, shut down for all intents and purposes the Orthodox Church. He's made himself the enemy of the Ukrainian people, and the Ukrainian population would love to get rid of him. The problem is that they have no weapons. The weapons all reside in the hands of his supporters. He has a monopoly on the means of violence or the control of weapons of violence. So there's not a whole lot that can be done until the Russians move. And I think that's the real question at this point. It's not so much what he says or anybody in the West says. The real question is, what are the Russians doing? We know that they've got about 300,000 troops in the northeastern corner of Ukraine. Now, those 300,000 are also matched on the other side of the border in Belarus by another 100,000 Ukrainian troops. They're just north of Kyiv. One expects something to happen because the principal reason for the offensive towards Kharkov was to draw the remaining Ukrainian forces that could fight northward, which would then open up the opportunity to cross the Dnieper at any number of different places, move across, turn north, turn south to Odessa, whatever you want to do. The Russians have not yet tipped their hand. Now, they are moving along the entire front. You pointed to that in Zaporizhzhia and elsewhere. I think they're eventually going to have to move all the way to the river. And the funny thing is that in the West, there's a failure to understand that this is not something the Russians want to do. The last thing that Putin wants to do is rule Ukrainians. He's not a fool. I mean, that would be like asking him to rule Lithuanians and Poles. That's a complete waste of time, wants nothing to do with that. He's looking for an end to this thing. And he's going to get it, he thinks, if he is more decisive vis-a-vis Kiev. And I think we're going to see a move on that city. I'm rather surprised it hasn't happened already. But I think Putin has always hoped against hope that someone would stand up in the West with some courage and say enough is enough. Let's negotiate an end to this. Now, there's some good news on the horizon for those of us that all want to see an end to the stupid killing, whether we're Russians, Americans, or Europeans. And that is what is happening today in France. The elections over the weekend. Looks like Le Pen has done a little bit better than anticipated. She's going to be in the next round. I don't think she's the Messiah or the savior of France by any means. But I think it's the beginning of the sort of glacial melting that needs to happen in Western Europe. Scholz, his approval ratings in Germany are in the basement. The Germans are ready to get rid of him, but they haven't yet put together an alternative. So Rishi Sunak is about as popular as the Black Plague in London. So I suspect that there's going to be upheaval there as well. Essentially, what we're witnessing are the beginnings of revolutionary change across Europe. And I'm sure that President Putin is aware of it. He's just not sure it's going to come soon enough, in his estimate, to end this war. I think it may well turn out that way. He may end up with a strategic partner who's willing to discuss an end to this. But it's too soon to tell. And so we're all sitting around asking the same questions. And I think only the Russians can provide the answer because Zelensky can do nothing. Now, the long-range strike weapons, those are revenge weapons. Acts of vengeance. You've defeated me, so I'm going to hurl things at you in the hopes that I make painful, strikes against you, that I harm Russians. I don't care if they're civilians or otherwise. And Ukrainians have been very, very generous with their use of strike weapons against not just military, but also civilian targets. So that's going to continue. And the danger now, as we've seen in the Black Sea, is that this could lead to a confrontation with us. As the Russians rightly point out, that none of those weapons would really work exclusively in the hands of the Ukrainians. It takes Western contractors, military supporters in whatever guise they're wearing right now, plus this enormous intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance complex in space and the terrestrial complex with manned and unmanned systems. So I suspect that we're going to see the Russians shoot down anything that comes within range. Now that I don't know what that means, because the response to Putin's comments and Lavrov and others was very simple. We'll send fighters to escort the global hawk. What a disaster. Then you're essentially saying you have to shoot me down. Then the question is, what do we do? I think Europeans are reaching a point where they've almost had enough. And so if they think they're going to go out there and lose some aircraft to the Russians, then mobilize 100 million people in Europe against Russia, they're delusional. I don't see that happening. I don't know what happens here. I don't see much appetite in the United States for war anywhere with anybody. But the problem is that most Americans don't hear anything from anyone that makes any sense. I mean, if you turn on cable news, it's fantasy world. You know, we like to joke, I'm in Orlando at Our Country, Our Choice. We're near Disney World, but the real Disney World is on the Potomac. And that's Washington, D.C., because reality doesn't intrude into their lives there very much. That could change, as you know, financially and economically very quickly, too, in the next few months. So I wish I had more definitive answers. I don't, but I think we're coming to the end. That much is clear. The problem in the Middle East is different. That's not coming to an end. That's just beginning to escalate.
Well, before we get to the Middle East, I just want to point out that I fully agree with you. It feels like things are coming to an end. There is this shift in the politics in Europe, but at the same time, we have NATO. Jens Stoltenberg is on his way out. The NATO chief coming in is the Dutch Prime Minister Rutte, who's just as hawkish and bullish on Ukraine as Jens was. You have the European Union. You have Washington, headed by Joe Biden, who says during the debate that this is a fight, this is an existential fight for freedom, and that Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet empire. There seems to be a real disconnect, but unfortunately, those people and those powers that I just mentioned have all the money, and they have the resources, and they're willing to plow them in and continue to plow them into Ukraine. We heard last week from reporters saying that Joe Biden was considering putting U.S. contractors in Ukraine to help assist with the maintenance of our weapon systems there, which seems to me like a bit of a slippery slope in terms of like boots on the ground. So how do we reconcile this? How do we get our leadership to actually recognize that this is the end, and that if things aren't turned around, poor Ukraine's going to be at even more of a disadvantage once they get to that bargaining table, whenever that is.
Well, Ukraine as a nation, I think, is being effectively destroyed. And I'm sure that there are lots of people in Washington, New York City, and London, exemplified by Larry Fink at BlackRock, that are only too happy to buy up the remains. I'm not sure that's going to work out quite as they hope. But having said that, I think there are a couple of things we should take note of. Lloyd Austin has been on the phone talking directly to the Russian Minister of Defense. Now, why is that significant? Significant because no one else in Washington has been willing to talk to anybody in the Russian government at all. Austin, and I'm by no means a fan or an avid admirer, but his voice has periodically reminded people inside the administration that we're not ready to fight a war against anyone. It's not just a function of our stocks are exhausted and that we can't meet any recruiting goals. We're getting about 50%, if we're lucky, of the manpower that we need in the Army and the Navy. So under those circumstances, I think he's well aware of our weaknesses and vulnerabilities right now. And he's just trying to hold things together. That's very different from Blinken, who is this sort of Trotskyite ideologue who believes in the perpetual revolution for democracy. Of course, his notion of democracy is very different from what you and I think, because this group thinks that it's found its way into power and should stay there forever, very much like the Bolsheviks. They're the kind of people that think that who votes is irrelevant, who counts the votes is important. And they're in the business of counting votes, not the other way around. So it's bad news, but we're presenting by no means a unified front. The other issue is, of course, the Russians themselves. If you listen to the voices coming out of Moscow, including President Putin recently, it's very concerning because they've about had it. Their patience is thin, and they're being very straightforward in their warnings and their capabilities, and they have them, and they can use them. And my concern has always been that you get an accidental confrontation with the Russians over something stupid like the Black Hawk or Global Hawk, or something else happens on the ground. There are now rumors, RT has talked about it, but it's not the first time, of an effort to build a dirty bomb using nuclear material from the power plants. They can do it. They have the ability to do it. I pray that we have nothing to do with that. But most of what's been going on inside Ukraine has been a CIA MI6 run operation. And those are very much rogue organizations that do not observe the rule of law and certainly are not concerned about the larger strategic implications. They think they're doing the Lord's work by confronting the Russians and pressing for a confrontation. So that's the unease that I feel, and I'm sure there are some others out there. I don't think we really understand who's in charge on any given day in the administration. Clearly, it's not Biden. Whatever he says or does is irrelevant. There are a lot of other people, though, in the White House and in his administration and major prolific donors that have a great deal of influence, and they want to continue. They're ideologically committed. This is one of the reasons why, in a statement that I made after the debate, I talked about holding elections early. And that gained a lot of traction. Millions of people were very excited about that. The interesting thing is gaining no traction whatsoever on the Hill. So much for your so-called Republicans, because if they were really concerned about this country, they'd hold elections early. They'd vote for it. And you could get a vote in the House and the Senate that said we should move up the date. Now, why is that important? It's important because the 25th Amendment allows you to remove the president if he's, in fact, non-compos menace, which looks increasingly to be the case with Biden. The problem is removing him changes nothing in the government. The rest of the government stays there. So you've got to get rid of people like Blinken and Mayorkas, Lloyd Austin, who else? Garland, Ray. Just go down the list. Most of the cabinet members, these people are all committed to our destruction.
What about the Senate and the House Armed Services and Foreign Relations committees? They're all run by hawks who are very committed to not only the conflict in Ukraine, but in Gaza as well.
Yeah, I don't think they're in touch with reality. I think they believe whatever comes out of the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies. And I think most of that is predigested nonsense designed for their consumption. Anybody who stands up and tells the truth, because I do talk to people that are in the intelligence business, they're simply shown the door. You can't break through this upper crust. You come down one level, true believers. You come down to another level, it's not so much true believers, but everybody's job depends on saying something stupid, and no one wants to put their jobs at risk. And then as you go down lower, you find people that are simply normal, intelligent analysts who are connecting the dots and saying, this is disastrous. We need to rein in Mr. Netanyahu. He is on a desperately dangerous track for his own country and for us. But nobody wants to hear that. Instead, we're, hurrah, hurrah, let's carry the fight further and make the Middle East permanently safe for Israel and whatever it wants to do. Same thing in Eastern Europe. Putin is still vulnerable. That's why Russia is now the 5th largest economy in the world, and their economy is thriving and ours is rapidly decaying. Nobody gets it. Nobody's willing to see reality. The same thing if you pick up the Daily Telegraph over in London, the stuff you read in there is just, you conclude these people are on hallucinogenics. Yeah. They think that they're in some sort of Churchillian moment against the evil Putin and his regime. It's sheer lunacy. It can't last, but it's already lasted too long, as we know.
So Biden says in the debate, he talks about when asked about Gaza, Israel, he says, "Oh, I've been holding back these 2,000-pound bombs because they're not helpful in densely populated areas, but we will give Israel all it needs to win the war against Hamas," and that's pretty much been his mantra. Giving them whatever it wants, whenever it wants. He hasn't used any leverage to keep Israel from destroying Gaza, keeping food and medical supplies and fuel from reaching Gazans. It's collective punishment for what Hamas did on October 7th. But meanwhile, Trump said during the debate that Israel should just finish it. So what do you think Trump means when he says that? Because he said that before. And what do you think should be done in Gaza for the betterment of all interests, Palestinians, Israelis, and even the United States?
Well, remember that President Trump, like all the other candidates in the race, is hostage to big donors who are avid supporters of the Israel lobby. So when he says he needs to get the job done, he's saying complete the task in Gaza and do nothing else. But he's not saying by all means complete the job, but don't kill another 50,000, 100,000 human beings. Don't destroy all the property. Don't continue the ruthless war of extermination that's ongoing. He can't say that. Neither can the other candidates, or they fear that all the money that's coming to them will go to whomever opposes them and is willing to pull, the Israeli lobby line. The sad part is that the business is not over in Gaza. Hamas is not defeated. People have admitted that. The leadership in the Israeli Defense Force has admitted it. They grossly miscalculated. They thought they would have been through in 30 to 60 days. One of the things I went back and looked at the Battle of Warsaw when the Polish Home Army rose up against the Germans. And it took the Germans about 60 days to put it down and clean it out. The Israelis have turned out to be unable to do that. So then you turn to this business of Hezbollah, and it looks very clear to me that we're headed into a war against Hezbollah. And that's interesting because you have one failed operation already in Gaza, and that's sort of an open wound that continues to fester and bleed. Now you want to march north into Lebanon. Now, I suppose they could use tactical nuclear weapons to destroy everything south of the Litani River, and they may do that. That, of course, opens Pandora's box, because then I think there will be attitudes in the rest of the world that anything you do against the Israelis is justified. So I'm hopeful they won't, but that may be that what they think is the solution there, because they've said go north of the Litani River or die. That's the message. I don't see that working either, frankly. And increasingly, they'll have to spread that war into Syria, because there's a great deal of a very large Iranian presence in Syria. At the same time, the Israelis are working with U.S. Central Command to put the Kurds into action, to persuade the Kurds to attack the Turks.
I hadn't heard that. Wow.
Oh, yes. And that's to keep the Turks off balance. Should the Turks suddenly decide enough's enough, we're joining the fight against Israel. Now, if you followed events recently about Cyprus, the possibility that the Israelis are using those British bases there is very, very high. Yeah. I think that's very probable. And Nasrallah says that makes Cyprus a legitimate target for them. The problem is I'd worry less about Nasrallah, but I'd worry a lot more about Turkey. And the Turkish foreign minister has spoken about it within the last 24 hours and said, we would not allow that to happen. If that happens, then we will be compelled to take action.
And it's a NATO country.
Yeah.
So that makes it even more stickier.
They've joined BRICS, and they've been a paper ally now for a long time. When I was in shape in 1999, they actually had to remove a couple of Turkish officers, one in particular, a lieutenant colonel, who was overtly Islamist and anti-Western, anti-European, anti-Christian. To the point where he was insufferable. He was on the edge of becoming violent. Now that's 1999. My impression is the Turkish military is now a repository, not just of Turkish nationalism, but also Islamism. So I think that they're chomping at the bit to fight, and there's no one they'd rather fight than Israel.
What about Israel chomping at the bit to get us into a war with Iran?
Well, clearly that's been from day one, Kelly. That's the best hope for Netanyahu, frankly. He's now challenging the whole Muslim world. Nasrallah talks about the Ummah, the whole Muslim world. Increasingly, that phrase and word is being tossed around in Egypt, in the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to Pakistan, all the way to North Africa. And I think the only way that he has any chance for success is to harness us to that war wagon. The problem is that we're not really in the ideal position to help much. Our ground force is in ruins. What's sitting in Eastern Europe isn't prepared to fight anybody anywhere. It's really disappointing when you look at the formations over there. I've got some friends on the ground, and they say, we've sat here too long doing nothing. So it's not an army that's ready to do much. It's already demoralized for other kinds of reasons. We don't need to go into diversity, inclusion, equity, and all that nonsense, and the affirmative action business. But I think the issue now is that we're going to rely exclusively on air and naval power. I don't know if we're going to have enough of that, quite frankly, to be successful. And we've already seen damage inflicted by the Houthis on an aircraft carrier, for God's sakes. So I don't see any good news on the horizon for Israel right now. I think they're on what I would characterize as a near suicidal path. And I don't think they're going to get everything they would like to get out of us. I certainly don't see a willingness to use intercontinental ballistic missiles against Iran for Israel, which means that whatever we're going to do will be conventional.
Let me ask you quickly about the Houthis. I mean, we have been deflecting their attacks for months now, over $1 billion worth of missiles. They keep coming. Is this degrading the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea, or is it just giving them like practice that they've never had before?
It certainly damaged the reputation of the United States Navy. Let's be clear. Our Navy is not in very good shape right now. They too have shortfalls in recruiting, shortfalls in reserves. We're not well provisioned and well structured to fight for very long in places like the Red Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean. Many of the Cold War structures are gone. The places where we could go to refuel, rearm, and reprovision are not available. The carrier group in the Eastern Mediterranean actually depends very heavily on things being flown into Israel from the United States and elsewhere, and Europe, food and so forth, to keep its forces afloat, fed, and provisioned. I don't have a good feeling, Kelly, about any of it. And I don't know that the Russians are as acutely aware of all of this as we are, thank God. Because if they discover just how weak we are and how vulnerable we are, it could be hell to pay for us. And there's not an easy way to respond. So I think we know where things are headed. I think in Ukraine, it's going to muddle forward unless the Ukrainians are successful in staging some sort of nuclear dirty bomb, and I hope that doesn't happen. Other than that, Ukraine is finished. And I don't see millions of Europeans lining up to enlist to fight in Eastern Europe. I just don't. And I think the polls, if you look at the polling data from Poland, which was always by far the most aggressively anti-Russian, the enthusiasm for fighting is gone. Population doesn't want it. If anything, it wants to get rid of the Ukrainians that they've got. They're tired of what they call Ukrainianization, and they can't afford it. And the EU everybody hates the EU. I mean, maybe the elites love it, but everybody else
love it.
You mentioned EU. Yeah. So I think we're going to see changes. I hope they come sooner rather than later, because the sooner they do, the more likely we're to have some sort of peace on the continent and end this pointless war with the Russians. But in the Middle East, that's a totally different animal. And that looks like it's racing out of control.
Well, one more question, because I have to ask it. David Petraeus raises his his noble head once again to weigh in, this time on the Gaza conflict, along with his compatriots Megan O'Sullivan and Richard Fontaine, in a Foreign Affairs article in which he says that Israelis should think about engaging an Iraq-style surge into Gaza. And he talks about clearing and holding territory to root out Hamas terrorists, just as U.S. forces did to insurgents operating inside Iraq, and that Israel can, quote, build and revive the next pillar of the surge narrative, and more broadly, the counterinsurgency theory that he imposed or engaged during the Iraq War, clearing and holding, the whole bit. To me, this is just one way for him to revise or rewrite history so that he maintains this fiction that the surge not only worked, but that he was the architect of this. And he consistently uses current conflicts like Gaza and Ukraine to reiterate this fantasy narrative. I was wondering if you can just give me a quick response to this.
Well, when it comes to David Petraeus and most of the senior officers that are retired or active, ignorance and a lack of understanding do not seem to operate as a bar against dumb remarks. The senior officers in the Israeli Defense Force are actually a pretty competent group. They've had at least 70,000 severely injured Israeli soldiers. I've seen evidence for more than 5,000 killed Israeli soldiers. Now, if you look at those numbers, you look at the size of the Israeli population, the numbers of men that they can put in the field, young men who can fight, that's not a pretty picture. Those may seem very modest losses, but compare those to what Petraeus was facing. Hamas is dramatically better, dramatically more committed, dramatically better equipped than anything we faced in Iraq. In fact, most of the opposition we faced in Iraq and Syria, to a lesser extent, Syria more, in Afghanistan, was really pretty weak. We could always dominate it with firepower. That's not true anymore. So I think he's saying things, first of all, that I would judge, if I were an Israeli, I would be insulted. Because the first thing I'd say is he doesn't understand what we're up against. He doesn't understand what we've done already. And now we can criticize the Israelis for destroying Gaza. I mean, if you really want to take the place, that's not how you do it. But I think we missed from the very beginning, assuming that this 7 October thing was legitimate. The more evidence I see, the more I question whether or not it was. In other words, it looks fishy. I was over there. I saw the Israeli security system around Gaza. It was excellent. Hard for me to believe that all of that got past the Israelis. But having said that, it became pretty clear within the 2 weeks after Gaza that the operation was about mass expulsion and murder of the population in Gaza. That's what it's about. We have actually tried to bribe General Sisi in Egypt by saying we'll forgive his $180 billion national sovereign debt if he takes in refugees, in other words, the Arab population from Gaza. Well, he knows if he does that, his people will assassinate him as a traitor to Islam. Because again, this is being turned into a war between the Israeli state and its determination to achieve, I would say, supremacy in the region against, quote unquote, the House of Islam. So the Israeli Defense Force now knows, and if you listen to their spokesman recently, knows very well they're up against a new problem. And that's one of the reasons that even though they've announced that our plans are ready for the invasion of southern Lebanon, they've been approved, there's no enthusiasm. People understand what that means. This is a war worse than anything that the Israelis have ever faced. This is a war of annihilation. Either they go in and annihilate Hezbollah, or they will be annihilated. And Hezbollah is not alone by any stretch of the imagination. And that's what people need to understand. As soon as you do that, the world changes. And I think just the other day, within the last 48 or 72 hours, that's a statement that Putin made. The world has changed, and he's right. We are clinging tenaciously to the last shreds of our financial, military, and economic hegemony. That's really what this has been about. The globalists have been exploiting the hegemony ruthlessly to dominate anyone and everyone who doesn't agree with us. Well, that's over. We can't do it. We can't afford it. We're going broke. The forces don't exist anymore. But in the minds of the people in DC, it's still 1991. And I don't think they appreciate the level of damage that has been inflicted on the Israeli Defense Force. I think the Israelis are beginning to figure it out. I hope so, because widening this war will not help them.
Well, thank you, Doug. I really appreciate everything that you do and your analysis as always. And I hope you return at some point, as this election unfolds, as well as these conflicts.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it.